Hi, my name is Rebecka Sheffield, and I'm the Executive Director for the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. This talk is entitled Social Justice Struggles for Rights, Equality, and Identity, the Role of LGBTQ Archives. This is really a discussion in three parts, or rather I have three different but related trains of thought that I want to share with you. Train 1, Hidden Histories and the Importance of Records. Train 2, The Emergence, Development, and Survival of Lesbian and Gay Archives. And Train 3, I'm calling Unstuck, Queer Memory and the Reparative Potential of Archives. And to ensure that these trains pull into the same station, I want you to keep in mind two central questions as we travel. How does shared heritage support social movements? And what role can and do archives play in struggles for identity, equality, and rights? Okay, let's start with hidden histories and the importance of records. I'm going to take a risk here and talk about Louisiana history, something that I know very little about, but I wanted to center at least this first part of my discussion on history that will hopefully hit close to home for some of you. So let me begin with a story about the Upstairs Lounge. Just down the road in New Orleans, in the French Quarter, and the site of the largest mass killing of gay people in recorded U.S. history. And I say recorded, but let's get back to this question in a moment. You know, I'm fascinated by queer histories. According to historian Mark Stein, the history of gay and lesbian life in New Orleans begins with a story about Captain Beauchamp of the frigate Bellone, who in 1724 was charged under French superior court with having an affair with a cabin boy. Not long after the ruling assembly transferred the cabin boy to another ship, Captain Beauchamp made a daring rescue and fled with the boy down the Mississippi River to the Gulf Coast. Now that is an origin story, and we know about it, for better or for worse, because colonial governments were really good at keeping records. But let's skip a couple of centuries or so and move up to 1973. One of the places that gay men and lesbians gathered in New Orleans in 1973 was a dingy second-floor bar called the Upstairs Lounge. Located in the French Quarter, at the corner of Chartres and Iberville on the second floor of a three-story building. According to filmmaker Roy Anderson, the summer of '73 was particularly challenging for a lot of New Orleanians. It was hotter and more humid than most, and the recession had left businesses starving for customers. But the shortage of gas and food in the region meant that gas stations and restaurants really had nothing to serve customers when they did wander in. This was the year that New Orleans ate snow cones and watched the Superdome being constructed. But people were getting by. The Upstairs Lounge had been founded in 1970 and served an eclectic clientele of doctors, lawyers, veterans, young folks, performers, actors. There was a theater inside, and of course vagabonds. And on the night of June 24th, 1973, the lounge was hopping. It was the last day of Pride weekend, and members of the Metropolitan Community Church, a pro-lesbian and gay Protestant denomination, held services inside the lounge and then hosted a free beer and dinner event for 125 patrons. About 60 people stayed on after dinner and listened to pianist David Gary perform, and they discussed plans for an upcoming fundraiser they were hosting for the Crippled Children's Hospital. At 7:56 p.m., a buzzer from downstairs sounded, and Luther Boggs went down to answer it, expecting a cab driver or a latecomer. You see, the door would be locked to prevent homophobes from just wandering in. It was neither of those things, however, but rather an arsonist who likely triggered the buzzer by setting a fire in the stairwell. When Boggs opened the door to the stairwell, he triggered a backdraft that exploded flames into the rest of the club. Bartender Buddy Rasmussen, an Air Force veteran, quickly led about 20 patrons out a side door and onto the rooftop. They climbed down a fire escape to safety. The rest, however, found themselves trapped between the exterior wall of the building and the fire. With bars on the windows, few were able to escape. 28 people died at the scene, and one other en route to hospital. 18 suffered critical injuries, and 3 later died in care. I will spare you the details of the scene. There are photographs of victims that were published later in newspapers, but needless to say, it was very gruesome. They never did find the arsonist, though there are credible theories, and in 1980, police closed the case. Now, the reason I share this rather disturbing history is that it isn't well known. In fact, most of my colleagues, fellow amateur historians, archivists, activists, have never even heard of the upstairs lounge. We know about Stonewall. We know about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and its subsequent repeal. If you're of a particular generation, you might recall the many brave men that came out as being gay during the AIDS crisis. More of you may remember when Ellen came out on national television. We held a big party at my house to recognize that monumental event. But few of us will have any knowledge of the histories that unfolded right in our backyards, because they're not recorded, because the documentation is poor or lost, or somewhere never to be found. What is interesting about the upstairs lounge fire is that it was documented. It was a significant tragedy in the city, witnessed by hundreds of people. It was on the front page of the New Orleans Times Colonist the very next day. CBS picked up the story nationally on the evening news. Yet while journalists reported the story, they downplayed the fact that the lounge was a gay bar, and it was ignored completely by government officials, who had previously declared days of mourning for victims of similar tragedies. Only one member of the clergy, a Reverend William P. Richardson, agreed to hold a prayer service, and for this compassion he was rebuked by the Episcopal Bishop of New Orleans, Iveson Noland, who claimed to have received more than 100 complaints from parishioners about the service for lesbians and gays. Both received ample hate mail. Several families of the deceased refused to step forward and claim bodies. As a result, 4 victims, 3 unknown and 1 later identified as Ferris LeBlanc, were buried in a mass grave in Potter's Field, paid for by anonymous donors. On July 1st, MCC founder Reverend Troy Perry, who came to New Orleans from Los Angeles, led a memorial service at a Unitarian church and a second at Mark's United Methodist Church. At that second service, an estimated 300 mourners exited through the church's main door, rather than the available side door, as a demonstration of solidarity and compassion. Helen Freund, who wrote about the fire on its 40th anniversary in 2013 for the New Orleans Time-Picayune, also describes the memorial service as an opportunity for gays and lesbians, their families, and allies to show a new willingness to be identified on the camera. Roy Anderson doubts whether the fire itself had any real impact on gay rights in the city, though it did lead to significant amendments in fire codes and inspection budgets. Today, the building that once held the upstairs lounge is still operated as a bar. The Jiminy, which ran out of the main floor in 1973, is still around. They now use the second floor as a storage area. A few years ago, they even shot an episode of Paranormal Investigation there, to communicate with the dead. Apparently, the Jiminy is haunted, as it should be. All of this is documented in records. Personal photographs, newspaper clippings and press photographs, film, journals, hate mail, floor plans, witness testimony in the form of transcripts, police records, oral histories. And all of this documentation is now being used to tell the story of the upstairs lounge fire and those who lost their lives, those who lost their friends and loved ones, those who had to go into work the next day and hold themselves together, to not cry, to not express grief, because they feared they would out themselves by mere association with such a place and such an event. Records witnessed these events, and records can tell stories. But in 1973, in a place that barely even acknowledged that there was a homosexual community, documentation that told the story of the upstairs lounge, or more importantly, the people who frequented the establishment, now those were scarce. Those were and are hard to come by. And yet, without this documentation, without these traces of a tragedy, and what it meant for a particular community at a particular time, we lose a texture, a callus perhaps, of history that gay people share, a shared heritage of persecution, of loss, sure, but also of love and relationship and resilience. Without records, history is rendered invisible, just like the many of those who perished in that fire. Now, Train 1 has entered the station, and that was a rather long introduction, but an important one, I think, and heavy nonetheless. So let's move on. I want to turn the discussion to a slightly lighter tone. Let's talk about resilience and pride and sustainability. Let's talk about the emergence and development of a lesbian and gay archives. But I also want to pause here for one moment before we leave the station to address the language that I'm using throughout this talk. So far, I've flipped rather casually between terms like gay and lesbian and LGBT and queer, and I'll admit that I'm fairly comfortable with any of these terms, but I'm also aware that terminology that we use to describe our identities, both individual and shared, needs to be sensitive and precise, which is sometimes challenging. Many of my students prefer the term queer to describe themselves and their communities, because it doesn't fall into the same trappings of identity politics that gay or lesbian might. Queer does not require a gender binary, so there's an openness to trans identities that's more inclusive. Queer also disrupts the hetero and homonormative identities that many of us feel are problematic and exclusionary. But queer is nevertheless a difficult word as well. It's an expression of violence that's been used against us in our childhood or early adulthood. It requires us to be political when we don't want to be. It is, however, the term that academics use to describe a particular kind of scholarship, queer theory, queer studies, and it has utility in that sense. And certainly I use the word queer in that way. I also use it to describe non-normative sexualities expressed throughout history, but for which no other term is as precise. Queer is also an umbrella term. In this talk, though, you'll hear me refer to lesbian and gay archives, not as queer archives. And this is a conscious decision to honor both the names and histories of the organizations that I'll talk about. They are, in effect, lesbian and gay archives. None identify as queer. But also to acknowledge the historical value in the terms gay and lesbian, because these words are more likely better adjectives to describe the identities of people involved in these organizations, at least initially, than queer. I'm also cognizant that none of the organizations in my research refer to themselves as trans or transgender archives, and I don't have time today to get into the histories and politics of why this might be true, and what are the implications of this exclusion. But I'd be happy to discuss that if you send me an email or give me a call. And I'd like to take that discussion further. For now, let's move on to lesbian and gay archives. Are you still thinking about the two questions? 1, how does shared heritage support social movements? And 2, what role can and do archives play in struggles for identity, equality, and civil rights? I want to begin by answering the first question and drawing from across a variety of different literatures. First, let's assume that shared heritage is good for you, or at the very least, more good than not. The literature on social determinants of health, which have been described as the social and economic factors that influence our health and well-being, suggests that those of us who experience social exclusion are at a much higher risk of health problems than those who feel a sense of belonging in their own communities. That is, the social inclusion processes that we experience throughout our lives can have considerable impact on our physical and mental health. Shared heritage, or culture, helps us feel the sense of belonging we need and allows us to form bonds with others. Because sexuality runs across ethnocultural, race, class, spiritual, language, and geographic lines, it's not always an obvious characteristic or feeling. More than that, sexuality has been subject to censorship, obfuscation, and regulation, criminalization, and pathologizing that has made it difficult for queer people to develop a shared heritage, let alone one that reflects resiliency and pride. For decades, gay men and lesbians have been isolated by fear, hiding in the shadows. But somehow, despite all these barriers, queer people have found each other and developed relationships, rich histories, and cultures. Anthropologist Esther Newton, who spent her career studying and documenting queer communities, has described how she felt as a young lesbian exploring her own feelings of same-sex desire. That she became an anthropologist in part because she had already learned how to navigate interpersonal relationships and socio-political and economic structures in order to find other lesbians and to learn about herself in the process of discovering how the lesbian world worked. What she found in the summer cottage communities of Fire Island, the drag families of Manhattan, the lesbian communes of upstate New York, was a common culture, a shared heritage where queer people found each other in safe spaces that they had carved out for themselves. John D'Amelio has written about sexual communities, as has Lillian Faderman, Ned Katz, and George Chauncey. I'm sure you've all heard the adage, there's power in numbers. United we stand, divided we fall. I hear that a lot at Women's Day marches and labor protests these days. When shared heritage is translated into the language of social movements, or more accurately into the literature on social movements, it's often associated with ideology. Ideology is traditionally understood as a set of conscious or unconscious ideas that comprise one's belief, goals, expectations, and motivations. Ideology is a comprehensive normative vision about how the world can and should function. I'm particularly interested in movements that emerged out of the protest cycle in the 1960s, student, anti-war, feminist, civil rights, and gay liberation movements. Writing about these social movements draws heavily from Habermasian constructivist theory and Melucci's concept of collective identity to explain how social movements come together in complex societies of late modernity. Melucci, for example, argues that successful movements find ways to reconcile individual identities and bind group members to one another, creating a cohesive collective identity or shared heritage that underpins a group's desire to seek social change and redress. The stronger one's sense of belonging in this community, the more likely they will participate in, or at the very least support, the work of a movement to push for social change. Now, as I've noted earlier, there's evidence of queer people and queer social spaces dating back centuries, but it's not until the post-war years, under the threat of McCarthyism and police harassment, that gays and lesbians begin to think of themselves as a minority class of people, and to envision a world in which they had basic human rights. By the end of the 1950s, groups such as the Mattachine Society, One Inc., and the Daughters of Bilitis had formed in large cities to help homosexuals, male and female, adjust to society that excluded them, criminalized their sexual behaviors, and treated their perversions with shock therapy and even lobotomies. These new homophile organizations provided men and women safe spaces to talk about their queer feelings and share advice on how to better integrate into mainstream society. Many homophile organizations also produced newsletters and magazines, some with readerships in the thousands. These publications became touchstones for gays and lesbians otherwise isolated by their own families and in their particular local communities. In the 1960s, we also see the rise of a gay press, pulp novels written for the one-handed reader, magazines and monographs. The underlying message in almost all of this was, "You are not alone." And that message was heard loud and clear. This is why, perhaps, in 1969, when news spread of an uprising against police harassment had occurred at New York's Stonewall Inn, queer people were already mobilizing. There was already the beginnings of a shared heritage. Meanwhile, in Canada, 1969 was also a watershed year for gay rights. You might recognize this handsome fellow, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. How many of you recognize his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau? In 1969, the senior Trudeau was Minister of Justice, serving the Canadian Liberal Party, and he helped pass the Criminal Law Amendment Act, an omnibus bill that introduced major changes to the Canadian Criminal Code. The bill legalized abortion, decriminalized the sale of contraceptives, introduced new offenses related to drinking and driving, harassment and cruelty to animals, and it effectively decriminalized homosexuality by removing several charges. So imagine, in 1969, Canada's gay and lesbian communities had an enormous fear lifted. They were no longer subject to criminal prosecution just for being who they were. And this in turn led to a significant willingness to write about homosexuality, to meet openly with other gays and lesbians, and to identify as a community. Now, I'm not suggesting that risk did not continue. Writing about non-normative feelings and behaviors remains risky even today. But the climate was very different in 1969 than it was in the post-war era. And it was in this new socio-political environment that a group of ragtag lefties founded the Body Politic, a news magazine that would not only provide an outlet for gays and lesbians to share news about their community, but a forum to discuss social, political, economic, and spiritual problems that continued to impact the health and safety of those who did not align with the straights. The first issue was published in fall 1971, and by 1973, founders Gerald Moldenhauer and Ron Damon had amassed a significant collection of materials related to the publication. Before the era of the internet, without email, with no fax machines, the publishing collective had exchanged letters and publications with gay groups and individuals from across the country and around the world. They had also built up a small library and produced their own body of work, photography and writing that documented the early years of the gay liberation movement. Moldenhauer has told me that one day a light bulb went off. He realized that they had created a documentary heritage that was significant and important and vital for the continued growth of the gay community. It was an archives of the Body Politic, but it was more than that. It was the archives of the liberation movement. And soon after, Moldenhauer founded the Canadian Gay Liberation Movement Archives to ensure that the collection of materials the publishing collective had created would be preserved, and that they would also continue to build the collection as a distinctively archival endeavor. Soon after founding, Moldenhauer left the project with Ed Jackson, another member of the Body Politic collective. He soon renamed the collection the Canadian Gay Archives, later to become the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And Jackson was also the first to articulate a guiding mission. He wrote, "A conspiracy of silence has robbed gay people of their history, a sense of continuity which derives from the knowledge of a shared heritage is essential for the building of self-confidence in a community. It is a necessary tool in the struggle for social change." Interesting, right? Even then, I think 1977, 1978, Jackson recognized the importance of shared heritage for social change, and the role that archives had in ensuring that this heritage would be preserved for future generations. Now, to go back, there was something else going on in 1973 that I think is worth noting. In 1973, the Body Politic ran 3 foundational articles by a historian named James Stakely. Translated from German to English for the first time, Stakely's work described a gay community that had flourished in the early 20th century Berlin, and the subsequent erasure of this community by the Nazis. Any evidence of this community, books, newsletters, photographs, were seized and destroyed, burned in fact. Some claim that famous psychologist Evelyn Hooker had the misfortune of witnessing the burning of sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld's library on what we now know as Kristallnacht. Anyone identified as gay was stripped of their personal belongings and sent to concentration camps alongside gypsies, the disabled, and Jews. They wore the symbol of a pink triangle on their uniforms, like you see here. If you're familiar with this symbol, you know about it through the work of James Stakely. At the risk of sounding dramatic, I would estimate that the commitment to ensuring the evidence of Canada's gay community would not ever again be lost to fascists established a sense of urgency for community archivists as they became what Terry Eastwood has called rescuer historians. I think fear of erasure is actually one significant strand in the story of their sustainability. Founders and champions went to great lengths to retrieve records from reluctant family members, dumpsters, and through meticulously collecting all of the pin buttons, t-shirts, and matchbook covers, postcards and handbills, and those wonderful one-handed novels. If they didn't rescue the material, who would? Now, knowledge of a lost queer community also produced a tremendous amount of paranoia among the collective that was put in charge of managing the fledgling archives. They trusted no one but themselves to manage the collections. After all, the archives was not only constituted to preserve evidence of their own experiences, but also to counter what they perceived as a failure on the part of mainstream heritage organizations to accurately and adequately document their experiences. Political and organizational autonomy was and remains vital to the character of the CLGA. And these fears have been realized more than once. In 1978, for example, the offices of the body politic, which also housed the archives, were raided by police, and several boxes of archival collections were removed. They were returned years later without an apology or an explanation. The CLGA also remains autonomous today, despite attractive offers from the provincial archives and the University of Toronto to take in some or all of its collections. That fear of erasure and paranoia continues to sustain the CLGA's desire to remain unentangled by institutional politics, and as a result, the CLGA remains a punchy grassroots organization, but serves a growing community as an entrenched part of the Canadian heritage landscape. This is the CLGA today. In 2009, the organization was gifted a heritage home by the City of Toronto. Our foyer is here. We acknowledge our financial sponsors. We're wholly funded through community donations, and people continue to give generously each month and each year. We have a reading room for researchers and guests. This is our rare book collection. And on the second floor, we have a gallery space that supports 4 exhibitions each year, 2 that showcase our collections, and 2 that engage with the collections to produce new creative work. We call these archival interventions. The exhibit here is part of our National Portrait Collection, a program that began in 1998 with 25 portraits of LGBTQ individuals who've made a difference in Canada. Today, that collection is over 70 portraits. And we also have a third-floor meeting space where we can hold our own meetings, and we can also make available to community groups. We have more than 20,000 books, 10,000 periodical titles, and thousands of audiovisual records, pin buttons, matchbook covers, and other artifacts, more than 3,000 vertical files that collect records on people, places, and events, and an entire house of archival collections. But let me also emphasize that the CLGA is one of a cohort of lesbian and gay archives that emerged alongside gay liberation and lesbian feminist movements of the 1970s and 80s. And I want to introduce you to 3 others. This is the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives in Los Angeles, which also grew out of the working files of a magazine, in this case, One, published by the homophile education group One Inc. Now, there are many parallels between the CLGA and its American counterpart, not the least of which is that they both represent themselves as national in scope and inclusive of both men's and women's experiences. The archives now resides in a former frat house owned by the University of Southern California. And in 2010, after almost a decade of development, Director Joseph Hawkins announced that the One Archives had donated its collections to USC Library, effectively ending 70-plus years of independent collecting. This is their current building, and they likely have the largest library of LGBTQ books, which you see here, probably the largest in the world. Like the CLGA, they also have artifacts such as protest signs, pin buttons, matchbooks. They collect handbills and newspaper clippings in vertical files, and they have an incredibly rich archival collection of personal and organizational papers. And like the CLGA, they support a curatorial program, but in their case, the One Gallery is a separate facility based in West Hollywood in a location provided rent-free from the city. Many scholars have used the collections at the One to produce new scholarship. Most recently, Lillian Faderman has just published a new book, The Gay Revolution, The Story of the Struggle, for which she conducted years of archival research at the One. My research has also taken me to two lesbian archives, the Lesbian History Archives in Brooklyn and the June L. Mazur Lesbian Archives in West Hollywood. Like the CLGA and the One, these archives were founded by rescuer historians desperate to bring together evidence of lesbian lives, but they were also founded to address the failure on the part of gay men's organizations to accurately and adequately document the lives of lesbian women. There are some fascinating identity politics that have unfolded as a result, but I'll have to tell you those over a glass of wine at some other point. The Lesbian History Archives has become an entrenched part of New York's lesbian community since it was first established in the home of founder Joan Nessel. For more than 40 years, Nessel and a team of dedicated archivettes have collected and cataloged the material evidence of lesbian cultures. In a recent discussion that I had with Joan Nessel, she described how she would sometimes come home from work and find butch lesbians weeping over collections of letters, of photographs, records confirming not only the existence of a lesbian history, but providing lingering glimpses into the richness and vibrancies of this past. Like the CLGA, the Herstory remains wholly autonomous as a political stance against what some people have referred to as a wall of pressure from academic institutions to hand over their collections. And finally, this is the June L. Mazur Lesbian Archives, which began as a personal collection in the home of Sherry Cox in 1981. Today, it resides in a location provided rent-free by the city of West Hollywood. And about 7 years ago, the Mazur was approached by the director of UCLA's Center for the Study of Women and asked to participate in a community development project that would bring several collections from the archives into the UCLA library system, where they would be digitized and rehoused for long-term preservation. The partnership is formalized in a memorandum of understanding that gives the Mazur the authority to pull back these collections if UCLA fails to keep them in Los Angeles or make them accessible to the public. Today, the Mazur mostly serves as a social space for older lesbians. They host book launches, music events, and other cultural activities. Not the usual kind of public programming one might expect from an archives, but the Mazur is perhaps the only lesbian space left in West Hollywood. Women's bookstores have now closed, bars cater mostly to men and younger women, and so the Mazur is the de facto social space for lesbian women of a certain generation. And there are certainly other lesbian and gay archives, the Ohio Lesbian Archives, the BC Gay Archives, Archives Gay du Québec, but the four that I profiled here are arguably the most well-known throughout North America and have the longest histories as organizations, as opposed to personal collections. Of course, there are any number of born digital archival initiatives popping up as well. Facebook tells me that there's an LGBTQ Archives project of Louisiana located in New Orleans. I didn't manage to find a similar organization in Baton Rouge, but I hope that you'll correct me later if I'm wrong. Now, in my dissertation project, I pay more attention to the ways in which these kinds of archives have sustained themselves throughout their histories. But for now, I want to simply emphasize that the purpose of these organizations, whether tangible or digital, founded in 1973 or 2012, is to collect and preserve that shared heritage that Ed Jackson wrote about. There's also a clear connection between the emergence and development of this cohort of community archives and the evolution of queer social movements throughout time. At its most basic, the connection is very simple. The archives have rescued and preserved scant evidence of lesbian and gay lives, allowing for the development of that shared heritage that fuels the gay rights movement, and to support the development of gay and lesbian studies. They house the evidence to support the ideological work necessary to support social change. Lesbian and gay archives also serve a symbolic purpose. As Stuart Hall has claimed, the moment an archives is constituted, this represents a particular moment. An archives is an object of reflection and debate. It means that a community that created it exists and has existed It renders experiences real and tangible. And so train 2 has arrived at the station. So let's move on to train 3, Unstuck, Queer Memory, and the Reparative Potential of Archives. But let's go back to those 2 questions. 1, how does shared heritage support social movements? And 2, what role can and do archives play? I've hopefully answered question 1, and I've tackled a bit of question 2. But question 2 is actually more complicated than it initially appears. Easy question to ask, difficult question to answer. We know that our collections have been used to write history books, to explore a lost queer culture, and to support legal cases. Just recently, we helped an immigration lawyer in Canada find evidence to support a refugee who was fleeing persecution in his home country because of sexuality. We recognize the symbolic power of the archives. We exist and we have always existed. I often think about that conversation with Joan Nessel when she described weeping butches poring over evidence of the richness of lesbian lives, the knowledge that you are not alone. To loop back to my earlier discussion, hidden histories and the importance of records, we know that lesbian and gay archives have been the rescuer historians, the pack rats, the hoarders, that have not only scooped up the detritus of the gay liberation movement and lesbian feminist movements, but they have also preserved scarce evidence of queer lives that can be read through personal photographs, sensational tabloid headlines clipped from the newspapers, police records, testimonies, oral histories. Lesbian and gay archives have cherished these records at a time when mainstream heritage organizations have thrown them in the garbage. And filmmakers, historians, and journalists are starting to tell these stories with the records. Look at all of the things that have been produced. These are all having to do with archival records. But to fully answer the second question, what role can and do archives play in struggles for identity, equality, and rights, we need to look at the ways in which lesbian and gay archives have actually done more than house the evidence to support the development of shared heritage. We need to look deeper, beyond the collections, and to the community building work that archives can and do take up. But we also need to muddy the waters. And this is where I want to turn my attention to what I call the reparative potential of the archives. In 2013, UCLA held a one-day symposium on archives and human rights. The keynote speaker was Vern Harris, who had served as Nelson Mandela's archivist for many years. Harris described how 20 years after the end of apartheid and in the wake of truth and reconciliation programs in South Africa, people were still feeling stuck. That is, the country was still trying to work its way out of racial segregation, away from colonialism, and toward a new cohesion, a sense of national identity. And Harris admitted that he often felt stuck, not knowing exactly how to approach reparations that would result in healing for South Africa. He suggested that archives and archival endeavors could actually provide the space necessary for the kind of reparative work that needs to happen. The Nelson Mandela Center of Memory is, for example, an archives of material created by and about Mandela. In a sense, it is the Nelson Mandela Archives, but it is much more than that. It's a meeting place with lectures and tours and activities and international advocacy work and so much more than a simple collection. The center, which is funded by the Nelson Mandela Foundation, has positioned itself as a portal that brings together dispersed communities to talk about Mandela and his life, and does not describe itself as the authority on what is and what was. This statement is also on the center's website. Dialogue is at once a vital instrument in addressing critical social issues and the most effective vehicle for sharing memory, for growing it, and for engaging it in the promotion of justice and social cohesion. I see a real echoing of Jackson's original mandate for the CLGA, a shared heritage so vital for a sense of belonging for people otherwise excluded from the public record. There are other kinds of memory projects that are attempting to do similar social justice work. Rwanda's Kigali Genocide Memorial Center, for example, represents a new form of memorial that positions trauma as cultural heritage. Sitting on a hill overlooking the capital city and built on the site of a mass grave, the center is a monument for those killed in the country's 1994 genocide, during which over 1 million ethnic minority Tutsi people were killed over the course of 100 days. Survivors are invited to share their stories of trauma inflicted by the ethnic violence, and these are posted on the center's website, along with family photographs and other documentation. Similarly, the House of Sharing in Gyeonggi-do, South Korea, is a hybrid heritage center and memorial that provides a tangible zone of contact for remembering the experiences of comfort women. These are women who were forced into sexual slavery during the Second World War. The house was initially founded in 1992 with funds from Buddhist organizations and local community initiatives as a residence for surviving comfort women, commonly called halmoni, but soon grew in scope to become 2 dormitories, a museum, an educational center, as well as a memorial. The House of Sharing collects records as evidence of comfort women's experiences, but also opens up space for younger Koreans to engage with this past, not only through museum objects, but also by meeting with surviving halmoni and listening to their testimonies. Thus, like the Nelson Mandela Center, it offers a space for dialogue. So the question is, what can and do lesbian and gay archives do to support this kind of reparative work? One very obvious way that lesbian and gay archives have contributed to community building is by simply continuing to provide a social space in the absence of any other. The Mazer Archives continues to be a place where lesbians of a particular generation come together and be in the same physical proximity. At the Herstory Archives, a lot of archival work happens around an old kitchen table. This social space is casual, comfortable, and functional. It also allows for intergenerational work to unfold, as seasoned volunteers mentor young archivettes who are literally sitting across the table from them. I see this intergenerational work happen at the CLGA as well, where long-serving volunteers spend hours teaching and mentoring emerging professionals, either volunteers or interns from local library schools. It's quite lovely to watch, and I love watching a young archivist search through collections of buttons or postcards and catch glimpses of queer past that are so often kitschy and lighthearted. I mean, here are a few of my favorites. I love these buttons. But there's difficult past as well, like the upstairs lounge fire, like the stories of police harassment, of queer bashing, of social isolation. It's quite something to look at where gay and lesbian rights have come to and reflect on that past. You know, the CLGA has never before had so much profile or received so much public awareness about the ways in which it safeguards the subtext of an entire generation of lesbian and gay activism. I think that the confluence of circumstances is not coincidental. The relative progress of the gay rights movement and the rising interest in gay and lesbian archives, both critical and dewy-eyed, are intrinsically connected. The connection between movement progress and archival sentimentalism has already been explored with some zest in the literature. As Heather Love points out in Feeling Backward, narratives of gay and lesbian progress inevitably recall the painful history of the homosexual's birth as one of modernity's backwards children. I love that quote. The archives are instrumental tools in the construction of a queer heritage, drawn from the glimpses of queer lives carefully extracted from the records. They are what Livia Iacovino calls arsenals of accountability, protecting the films, photographs, writings, and ephemera that buttress the historical and sometimes hagiographic queer scholarship that has been built around and about queer social movements and their adherents. Lesbian and gay archives are also aspirational sites through which community members can begin a process of what Shoah scholars have called memory telling, the process of creating narratives of the past interwoven with perceptions of the present and dreams for the future. This follows a call by Jose Munoz for queer people to resist falling into the narcissistic hollow of abjection and adopt the lens of futurity and hope that he sees as so vital for moving forward. Lesbian and gay archives are tangible zones of contact for memory telling and optimism that also provide opportunities to touch, feel, and read records imbued with evidence of that shared past. KJ Rawson, Anne Svetkovich, and Kate Eichhorn have also explored the potential for the kinetic archives as a place where queer people can go to experience something profoundly moving, to bring them closer to their own personal journey of recovery from the everyday trauma of homophobia and heterosexism. But I also want to be clear about the future of lesbian and gay archives. One could argue that the movements that produce these archives are in decline. Certainly, the gay liberation movement has been floundering since the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. The same could be said about the lesbian feminist movements that spawned the Mazer archives and the Herstory archives. In Canada, the gay rights movement is in decline because it has actually succeeded in attaining most of its central goals. We have, for the most part, gained legal protections and civil rights for gays and lesbians. Gays have become the cause célèbre for corporations wanting to demonstrate their hipness factor. A few things have happened in the wake of this political progress. New queer movements have emerged that challenge the liberal and neoliberal bents of gay rights discourse. Critical race theory has challenged the whiteness of gay rights movements and the canonization of certain gay histories, and challenges from bi and asexual activists have called into question the value of homocentric civil rights. We are not all gay or straight. There are a lot of identities in between, and no doubt the emerging trans movements have challenged lesbian feminists and gay rights movements as a whole on its trans exclusionary practices that have effectively erased the role of trans-identified folks from gay histories. The debates of the fact of Stonewall is a great example. What I want to leave you with today is perhaps a way forward. The understanding that archives are both instrumental and aspirational sites is useful in drawing a line between the progress of gay rights and our urgent desire for reflection and for critical engagement with the past. Archival research has contributed and continues to add to the work of political and ideological reparations, and I would argue that this kind of work can continue. I said at the beginning of this hour that records tell stories, and they do. But it takes human interaction with these records to interpret this story. The records may not change, but those interpretations will. Lesbian and gay archives are potentially reparative because they can allow for the kind of critical engagement to unfold. The same records can be used as evidence in liberal gay rights stories, in projects that seek to make visible invisible trans stories, to explore a multiplicity of voices within the same documentary heritage. Lesbian and gay archives offer more than just subtext, more than places of reflection, more than. They offer space for the kind of radical democracy that, as Michelle Caswell has suggested, is a messy cacophony of multiple voices, and not always in agreement about how to push forward. These are places where records and their creators are part of the contested narratives of queer movements. And is the very fact that lesbian and gay archives are contested that I think we continue to invest in these places, though they appear to privilege certain voices while silencing others. At some point, we must ask ourselves why people have rallied around these archives, even though it's become apparent that they are unable to meet the needs of the most marginalized members of the queer community. Not just sites for the important, and this cannot and should not be undervalued, work of memory telling, but also for reparation. Thank you for listening, and I wanted to send a special thank you to the Louisiana State University for sponsoring this talk, in particular the College of Human Sciences and Education, which houses the School of Library and Information Science and the School of Social Work. And I'd also like to thank the LSU Libraries and Special Collections, And of course, the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. What amazing volunteers you have that have supported me and my work here. And I'd like to throw a special thank you to Dr. Edward Benoit and Dr. Elaine Macchio for hosting me at Baton Rouge and for making this talk happen. If you'd like to continue this conversation, please feel free to drop us a line, www.clga.ca, or you can contact me directly at executivedirector@clga.ca. I look forward to it.